Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells, where we explore the brilliant mind and extraordinary cases of the world's greatest detective, Hercule Poirot. Tonight, we present a tale of botanical obsession, Victorian splendor, and poisonous secrets. A case that spans 50 years and culminates in murder most exquisite. Within the gilded glass walls of a magnificent conservatory, where rare orchids bloom once in a lifetime, Hercule Poirot must untangle a web of greed, revenge, and long-buried crimes. So settle in, pour yourself a tisane, or perhaps something stronger, and let us begin. This is Murder at the Golden Conservatory. The afternoon post arrived at Hercule Poirot's London flat with its customary punctuality, delivered by the porter, who had learned to recognize the distinctive cream-colored envelopes that so often heralded another sojourn into the darker corners of human nature. Poirot, who had been engaged in the meticulous arrangement of his collection of Victorian snuff boxes, received the correspondence with his characteristic precision, examining the envelope before slitting it open with a silver letter knife that bore the crest of a grateful Belgian nobleman. The letter within bore an address embossed in gold: Thornfield Manor, Gloucestershire. The writer, a Lady Cassandra Thornfield, employed a script both elegant and tremulous, suggesting advanced age or agitation. She begged Monsieur Poirot to attend a weekend gathering at her country estate, where she feared, though she could not precisely articulate why, that catastrophe loomed over her family. The letter mentioned, with deliberate vagueness, family tensions, an approaching anniversary of significance, and a collection that had attracted unwelcome attention. Poirot's eyes, small and intensely green, gleamed with interest as he reread the missive. It was the quality of the fear that intrigued him, the sense of dread emanating from between the carefully chosen words. Within 2 days, Poirot found himself aboard the afternoon train from Paddington, his travelling case positioned precisely in the overhead rack, his person immaculately attired in a suit of dark blue worsted, his moustaches waxed to formidable points. The journey through the English countryside offered its usual tableau of rolling hills and hedgerows, now touched with the amber light of late November. His research into the Thornfield family had revealed a lineage both distinguished and troubled. Sir Edmund Thornfield, the current baronet, had inherited an estate rich in history and poor in liquid capital, a common enough predicament among the English aristocracy. The family's fortunes had been built on sugar plantations in Jamaica, a source of wealth that had dried up with emancipation and changing trade patterns. Lady Cassandra, Sir Edmund's mother, was the family matriarch, a woman of formidable will who had outlived 2 husbands and maintained her grip on Thornfield Manor despite her son's legal ownership. The family's most celebrated possession was the Golden Conservatory, a Victorian marvel constructed in 1873 by Sir Edmund's grandfather after winning a substantial sum at cards. The structure, transported piece by piece from the Paris exhibition, was said to be a wonder of iron and glass, housing an exotic collection of tropical plants and, most famously, the Thornfield orchids. The motorcar that collected Poirot from the village station travelled along increasingly narrow lanes, stone walls giving way to iron railings that marked the boundaries of the Thornfield estate. The house itself emerged gradually from the landscape, a Georgian edifice of honey-coloured stone, handsome but somewhat austere. What arrested the attention, however, was the structure adjoining the eastern wing, a cathedral of glass and gilded ironwork that caught the declining sun and threw it back in thousandfold brilliance. The Golden Conservatory. Poirot permitted himself a small sound of appreciation. The driver, a taciturn man of advanced years, volunteered that the structure was, indeed, a sight, though he added darkly that beauty often masked wickedness. A philosophical observation that Poirot filed away for future consideration. The automobile drew up before the main entrance, where a butler of intimidating dignity awaited. This personage, who introduced himself as Fitzwilliam, conducted Poirot into a drawing room of considerable elegance, where a fire burned despite the mildness of the afternoon, suggesting that economy had not yet forced the Thornfields into genuine hardship. Lady Cassandra received Poirot with a relief so palpable it bordered on unseemly. She was a woman in her late 70s, dressed in black silk that whispered with her movements. Her white hair arranged with severe elegance, her face showing both the beauty she had possessed and the determination that had sustained her through decades of managing family affairs. She gripped Poirot's hand with surprising strength, her eyes searching his face as though seeking reassurance that he could indeed prevent the catastrophe she anticipated. Poirot settled her into a chair by the fire and positioned himself opposite, his manner combining sympathy with professional detachment. Lady Cassandra's story emerged in fits and starts, interrupted by moments when emotion threatened to overwhelm her composure. The family had gathered, she explained, to mark the 50th anniversary of her late husband's death, an observance that might seem morbid, but which provided excuse for assembling the scattered clan. More significantly, the anniversary coincided with the anticipated blooming of the Midnight Emperor, the rarest orchid in the family's collection, a plant that flowered only once every 50 years, and whose blooms, when they appeared, were said to be of incomparable beauty and worth a fortune to collectors. The orchid had attracted attention beyond the family circle. Sir Edmund, pressed by financial necessity, had entertained offers from collectors and institutions, a prospect that Lady Cassandra opposed with fierce determination. The plant, she insisted, must remain at Thornfield, both as a symbol of family continuity and because she believed, though she knew it sounded foolish, that it was protected by some manner of guardian influence that would revenge its removal. Poirot's expression remained courteously neutral at this mention of supernatural protection, though his fingers did briefly touch his moustache, a gesture that betrayed internal amusement. Lady Cassandra hastened to explain that she was not truly superstitious, but the orchid had been her husband's particular passion, and his death, which had occurred in the conservatory itself, had been both sudden and never fully explained. The official verdict was heart failure, but Lady Cassandra had always harboured doubts. Now, with the family assembled and the orchid approaching bloom, she felt oppressed by premonitions of disaster. Poirot inquired as to the identity of the gathered guests. Lady Cassandra provided a catalogue that suggested both family dysfunction and romantic entanglement. Sir Edmund himself was present, of course, a man of 53 whose chief characteristics appeared to be weakness and a facility for poor decisions. His wife, Lady Margaret, was a beauty of faded glory who consoled herself with the attentions of younger men and the maintenance of appearances. Their daughter, Vivian, was 22 and betrothed to Captain James Ashford, a decorated war hero whose impeccable credentials masked, in Lady Cassandra's opinion, a mercenary interest in the Thornfield fortune. Sir Edmund's younger brother, Arthur, had arrived from London, where he pursued vague artistic interests and maintained an establishment whose funding remained mysterious. Arthur's companion was a Mr. Sebastian Vale, a dealer in rare botanical specimens whose professional interest in the Midnight Emperor seemed to eclipse any social pretense. Rounding out the party was Dr. Henry Blackwood, the family physician who had attended the late Sir Edmund during his fatal collapse, and who maintained a presence in the household that Lady Cassandra found both necessary and vaguely troubling. Before Poirot could pose further questions, the door opened to admit a young woman whose entrance suggested both authority and agitation. This proved to be Vivian Thornfield, who had apparently been informed of the detective's arrival and who had come to assess him personally. She possessed her mother's beauty, but displayed it with less calculation. Her dark hair somewhat dishevelled, her eyes red, as though from recent tears. She addressed Poirot with a directness that bordered on rudeness, demanding to know what qualifications he possessed to interfere in family matters, and whether he truly believed he could prevent disasters through methods that seemed to her more theatrical than scientific. Poirot received this assault with equanimity, permitting himself only the mildest of smiles as he assured Miss Thornfield that his methods, though perhaps unconventional, had proven effective in matters considerably more complex than family gatherings. Vivian's hostility seemed to evaporate as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a distress that suggested genuine fear. She confessed that she believed herself to be watched, that someone in the house meant harm, though she could not specify who or why. Her upcoming marriage, she suggested, might provide motive, as her inheritance included certain interests in the estate that would pass to her husband upon her wedding. The conversation was interrupted by the summons to dress for dinner, a ritual that the Thornfields apparently maintained despite their financial anxieties. Poirot was conducted to his chamber, a comfortable room overlooking the gardens and offering a view of the Golden Conservatory, which was now illuminated from within, creating an effect both magical and slightly sinister. The building glowed like a jewel against the darkening sky, its gold framework seeming to pulse with life. Poirot stood at his window for some moments, his mind already cataloguing the personalities and potential motives that Lady Cassandra's narrative had revealed. Financial desperation, romantic complications, family resentments, and an object of considerable value. The elements of tragedy were assembled. Whether they would coalesce into actual crime remained to be determined. Dinner was served in a dining room that combined Georgian elegance with Victorian elaboration, the table laid with crystal and silver that had clearly been retrieved from storage for the occasion. The assembled company presented precisely the tableau that Lady Cassandra's description had suggested. Sir Edmund proved to be a man of diminished vitality, his face marked by disappointment and alcohol, his manner oscillating between forced joviality and querulous complaint. Lady Margaret maintained a facade of gracious hospitality, while her eyes constantly sought her reflection in the various mirrors and polished surfaces that adorned the room. Captain Ashford displayed the upright bearing and clipped speech of his profession, though Poirot detected beneath the military correctness a calculation that suggested the officer had learned to assess situations for advantage. Arthur Thornfield affected the artistic temperament, his clothing dramatically bohemian, his conversation peppered with references to obscure painters and philosophers. His companion, Mr. Vale, was a surprise, a man of perhaps 40, with the predatory leanness of a bird of prey, his speech marked by an American accent and his manner suggesting barely suppressed energy. Dr. Blackwood proved to be a man of late middle age, distinguished in appearance, with the professional manner that inspired confidence while discouraging intimacy. He observed the company with eyes that suggested both medical assessment and personal interest, his gaze lingering on Lady Margaret with an attention that might have been purely clinical, but seemed to contain warmer elements. The conversation at dinner ranged across safe topics: politics and weather and London gossip, but beneath the surface pleasantries ran currents of tension that Poirot's practiced sensitivity could easily detect. When Mr. Vale mentioned the Midnight Emperor and inquired when they might view this legendary specimen, the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sir Edmund, emboldened by wine, declared that they would all inspect the conservatory after dinner, a pronouncement that drew a sharp glance from his mother and a small smile from Mr. Vale. The expedition to the Golden Conservatory commenced with a somewhat theatrical air, Fitzwilliam, the butler, leading the way with candelabra, while Sir Edmund followed with brandy glass in hand, offering a commentary that mixed botanical fact with family legend. The conservatory entrance was reached through a covered walkway, and as the party crossed the threshold, even Poirot, not generally susceptible to atmospheric effects, felt a momentary sense of entering another realm. The interior temperature was markedly warmer than the house, maintained, Sir Edmund explained, by a complex system of steam pipes and vents. The space was organised into distinct zones, each dedicated to plants of different origins and requirements. Ferns from New Zealand occupied shadowed corners, their fronds unfurling like green lace. Orchids from Southeast Asia clung to artificial trees, their blooms creating cascades of colour and form that seemed almost artificial in their perfection. Palms from the Caribbean stretched toward the glass ceiling, their leaves rustling in air currents created by hidden vents. The party proceeded along paths of crushed marble toward the conservatory's heart, where the Midnight Emperor resided in solitary splendour. Orchid occupied a position of honour beneath the central dome, elevated on a pedestal that brought it to eye level. The plant itself was impressive rather than beautiful, its thick stems dark and slightly sinister, its leaves a deep green that bordered on black. The flower buds, of which there were 3, remained tightly closed, but even in this state, they suggested the magnificence of the blooms they would eventually reveal. Mr. Vale approached the plant with reverence, bordering on worship, his hands reaching out, but not quite touching, his breath quickening audibly. He murmured something about cellular structure and pigmentation, then turned to Sir Edmund with naked longing in his eyes, declaring that he would offer £50,000 for the plant and its immediate transport to his facilities in America. Sir Edmund's face registered surprise at the increased sum, previous offers apparently having been considerably lower. Before he could respond, Lady Cassandra's voice cut through the humid air with diamond precision. The plant was not, would never be, for sale at any price. The tension that had been building throughout the evening crystallized in this moment of confrontation. Mr. Vale argued with passionate intensity, citing the plant's scientific value, the inadequacy of its current care, the waste of maintaining such a treasure in private hands. Lady Cassandra remained immovable, her determination rendered absolute by grief and stubbornness. Sir Edmund attempted mediation, suggesting that the matter might be discussed further, earning looks of contempt from both his mother and the American. Captain Ashford intervened with a soldier's directness, proposing that business matters were inappropriate for the evening and should be deferred to morning councils. His fiancée, Vivian, had withdrawn to the shadows, her face pale in the candlelight, her eyes fixed on the orchid with an expression Poirot could not quite interpret. Arthur Thornfield and Dr. Blackwood conversed in low tones, the physician's attention ostensibly on Lady Cassandra's agitation, while the younger Thornfield brother appeared more interested in observing the reactions of the assembled company. The party returned to the house in subdued spirits, the magical atmosphere of the conservatory having been dispelled by financial realities and family discord. As they re-entered the drawing room, Lady Margaret announced her intention to retire, pleading a headache that may or may not have been genuine. Her departure seemed to signal the evening's conclusion, other guests following her example, with expressions of fatigue and wishes for pleasant dreams that rang hollow. Poirot found himself momentarily alone with Lady Cassandra, who gripped his arm with urgent strength and whispered that she felt it beginning, the sense of impending catastrophe that had driven her to summon him. She begged him to prevent whatever evil was approaching, to protect not just the orchid, but the family itself. Poirot offered what reassurance he could, promising vigilance and the application of his little grey cells to the problem. As he retired to his own chamber, however, he could not deny that the house possessed an atmosphere of unease that transcended mere family tensions. Sleep came eventually, but was disturbed by dreams of glass cathedrals and flowers that bloomed with sinister beauty. Poirot woke several times, each time requiring moments to orient himself in the unfamiliar room. During one such wakeful period, he heard sounds from below, voices raised in argument, though the words were indistinct. He consulted his pocket watch. 3 o'clock in the morning, an hour when respectable persons should be sleeping. He rose and went to his window, looking out over the darkened gardens toward the conservatory, which remained illuminated, a beacon of golden light against the surrounding darkness. As he watched, he observed movement within, a figure crossing behind the glass walls. The distance was too great for identification, but the person appeared to be moving with purpose, examining or perhaps manipulating something among the plants. Poirot considered investigating, but decided against it, reasoning that a nighttime prowler in the conservatory might flee upon confrontation, whereas patient observation might reveal more. He settled himself in a chair by the window and maintained his vigil until dawn began to pale the sky. Breakfast was served informally in a morning room overlooking the gardens, guests appearing according to their habits and inclinations. Poirot, who had descended early, found himself sharing the initial meal with Captain Ashford and Dr. Blackwood, both men apparently being of military or medical disposition toward early rising. The conversation was carefully neutral, touching on London news and the exceptional mildness of the weather. Mr. Vale appeared next, his energy apparently undiminished by whatever sleep he had obtained, his conversation immediately turning to orchids and their cultivation. He spoke with the enthusiasm of a true specialist, describing the biological mechanisms that produced the Midnight Emperor's rare blooming cycle, and speculating on the chemical composition of the pigments that would create its supposedly unique coloration. Poirot listened with apparent interest, while actually observing the American's hands, which showed no signs of dirt or plant material, despite his nocturnal visit to the conservatory. The arrival of Sir Edmund, looking haggard and moving with exaggerated care, suggested hangover rather than restful sleep. He helped himself to coffee with trembling hands and ignored the covered dishes of eggs and kidneys with visible distaste. His mother entered shortly thereafter, her bearing upright despite the early hour, her expression suggesting that her night had been no more restful than Poirot's own. Vivian appeared last of the family members, her eyes shadowed, but her manner determinedly cheerful, greeting her father with a kiss, and her fiancé with a smile that seemed to require effort. Lady Margaret's absence was noted, but not commented upon, the lady apparently being one who maintained aristocratic hours regardless of household schedules. Arthur Thornfield had also not appeared, though his habits were unknown to Poirot and might well run to late rising. The morning's activities were left undefined, the weekend gathering having no formal program beyond the anticipated viewing of the orchid's blooming, which Dr. Blackwood estimated would occur within 48 hours, based on the development of the buds. Mr. Vale proposed another inspection of the conservatory, ostensibly to make detailed observations of the plant's progression, but more likely to make another assault on the family's determination not to sell. Sir Edmund surprised everyone by agreeing readily, adding that he wished to check the environmental controls, as he had noticed some irregularity in the temperature during his own early morning visit to the structure. This revelation drew sharp glances from several persons, Poirot noting particularly the expression of alarm that crossed Dr. Blackwood's face, and the satisfied smile that briefly appeared on Arthur Thornfield's lips. The party that set out for the conservatory was smaller than the previous evening's expedition, Lady Cassandra declining on grounds of fatigue, and Lady Margaret's continued absence reducing the numbers further. Captain Ashford attended, though his interest seemed focused more on his fiancée than on botanical specimens. The morning light transformed the conservatory, rendering it less mysterious but more magnificent. The golden framework gleaming against blue sky, the glass panels creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the paths within. The temperature inside was indeed warmer than Poirot recalled from the previous evening, the air thick and moist, condensation forming patterns on the glass walls. Sir Edmund proceeded directly to a panel of gauges and valves that controlled the heating system, his face darkening as he examined the readings. Someone, he announced with suppressed fury, had altered the settings, increasing both temperature and humidity to levels that, while not immediately dangerous to the plants, were considerably higher than optimal. The implications of this sabotage rippled through the assembled company. Mr. Vale immediately protested that such accusations were offensive and that he would never endanger a botanical specimen, regardless of any commercial interest. Captain Ashford observed with military precision that the question was not who would damage the plant, but who had both access and motive to do so. All present had access, Poirot noted quietly, and as for motive, that remained to be established. Arthur Thornfield suggested, with apparent amusement, that perhaps the orchid itself had decided to hasten its blooming, a whimsical notion that no one found entertaining. Sir Edmund was adjusting the controls when a cry from Vivian drew everyone's attention to the Midnight Emperor itself. The young woman had approached the plant for closer examination and had discovered something that the previous night's dim lighting had concealed. Attached to one of the stems, barely visible against the dark foliage, was a small glass vial connected by rubber tubing to the plant's root system. The vial contained perhaps 2 inches of clear liquid. Dr. Blackwood reached the plant first, his professional training apparently overcoming any hesitation about destroying evidence. He carefully detached the apparatus, examining it with the concentration of a physician diagnosing illness. His pronouncement was delivered in tones of clinical certainty. The vial had contained some form of chemical compound that had been slowly dripping into the plant's soil. Without analysis, he could not determine the substance's nature, but the intention seemed clear enough, either to accelerate the blooming process or to poison the plant entirely. The discovery transformed the morning's expedition from botanical tour to crime scene investigation. Poirot, who had remained silent during the initial reactions, now stepped forward with authority that seemed to surprise those who had perhaps dismissed him as merely decorative. He requested that nothing further be disturbed, that all present provide account of their movements during the night, and that the apparatus be preserved for analysis. Sir Edmund blustered about calling the police, but Poirot suggested gently that the matter might first be investigated privately, as involving authorities would certainly result in publicity that the family might prefer to avoid. Lady Cassandra's fears, it appeared, had been prophetic. Someone in the house harboured intentions that were at minimum malicious and at maximum murderous. The question was whether the target was the plant or something more sinister. The company returned to the house in disordered fashion, the comfortable patterns of a country house weekend having been disrupted by the evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. Poirot observed the reactions with professional interest. Mr. Vale's agitation seemed genuine, his concern for the plant's welfare apparently transcending his commercial interest in acquiring it. Captain Ashford had adopted a protective stance toward Vivienne, who appeared more frightened than the situation seemed to warrant. Arthur Thornfield maintained his air of amused detachment, though his eyes were sharp with intelligence that his affected bohemianism concealed. Sir Edmund oscillated between rage and anxiety, perhaps calculating the financial implications of damage to his most valuable asset. Dr. Blackwood had taken charge of the mysterious apparatus, promising analysis while warning that his country practice did not include sophisticated chemical testing facilities. The gathering in the drawing room had barely commenced when Fitzwilliam appeared with news that contributed further to the morning's disarray. Lady Margaret had been found in distress in her chambers and was requesting Dr. Blackwood's immediate attendance. The physician departed with commendable speed, returning some 20 minutes later with an expression that combined professional discretion with genuine concern. Lady Margaret, he reported, had apparently taken some manner of sleeping draught the previous night and was experiencing after-effects that suggested either an excessive dose or an unfortunate reaction to the medication. She would recover, but required rest and should not be disturbed. When questioned about the source of the sleeping draught, Dr. Blackwood acknowledged with some embarrassment that he had provided her with a mild sedative some weeks previous, but the symptoms she was displaying suggested a considerably stronger preparation. Poirot requested a private interview with Dr. Blackwood, a conversation that revealed both the physician's professional competence and his personal entanglement with the Thornfield family. He had attended the late Sir Edmund during his final illness, a sudden collapse in the conservatory that had occurred during a solitary inspection of his orchid collection. The symptoms had been consistent with cardiac failure, though the rapidity of the decline had been unusual in a man who had shown no previous signs of heart disease. The doctor had always harboured private doubts about the diagnosis, but had possessed no evidence to support alternative explanations. His continued presence in the household, he admitted with reluctance, was motivated partly by professional concern for Lady Cassandra's health, and partly by personal sentiments toward Lady Margaret that he recognised as both inappropriate and unlikely to be reciprocated. Armed with this information, Poirot proceeded to interview the other household members individually, a process that consumed much of the afternoon and revealed a constellation of secrets, resentments, and fears. Sir Edmund confessed to debts of alarming magnitude, held by persons who employed unpleasant methods of collection. The sale of the Midnight Emperor would discharge these obligations, but would also deprive the estate of its most marketable asset and earn his mother's undying enmity. He had visited the conservatory during the night, he admitted, to consider the orchid and wrestle with his conscience, a struggle that had apparently been aided by continued consumption of brandy. Arthur Thornfield revealed that his artistic pursuits were essentially fictitious, maintained as cover for a life of comfortable indolence, funded by periodic appeals to his brother's guilt and generosity. He had no particular interest in the orchid, beyond its value as leverage in securing continued financial support. Captain Ashford's interview proved most illuminating. The young officer's military bearing concealed romantic complications of considerable complexity. His betrothal to Vivian had been undertaken partly from genuine affection and partly from calculation. His own family, though respectable, was without fortune, and marriage to an heiress would secure his future. However, he had recently discovered that Vivian's inheritance was contingent upon her marriage to a man of whom Lady Cassandra approved. Approval that could apparently be withdrawn should the matriarch discover certain facts about the captain's past. These facts, which Ashford declined to specify in detail, involved gambling debts and associations with persons of questionable character. His presence in the house was therefore motivated by urgent need to secure the marriage before any investigation into his history could be conducted. Vivian herself presented a figure of considerable pathos when interviewed privately. Her fears, which she had previously expressed in vague terms, crystallized into specific terror. She believed that someone in the house meant to kill her. The attempt on the orchid, she was convinced, was merely preliminary to an assault on her person. Her reasoning, when Poirot pressed for details, seemed to rest on a series of incidents that individually appeared insignificant, but collectively suggested a pattern. A riding accident, when a saddle girth had mysteriously frayed. A near fall on stairs, when carpet had come loose at a critical moment. A close call with a falling flower pot that had missed her by inches. None of these incidents could be definitively proven as deliberate, but their accumulation had convinced Vivian that someone wished her dead, most likely to prevent her marriage and the consequent alteration of inheritance patterns. Mr. Vale's interview revealed a man of surprising complexity beneath his commercial exterior. His interest in the Midnight Emperor, while certainly professional, had roots in personal history. His grandfather had been a naturalist who had spent years searching for this specific orchid in its native habitat, dying eventually of fever without having achieved his goal. Vale's pursuit of the plant thus combined scientific interest, commercial opportunity, and filial piety. He admitted freely to having visited the conservatory during the night, driven by inability to sleep and desire to observe the plant more closely. He had noticed the elevated temperature, but had attributed it to normal operational variation rather than tampering. He vehemently denied any knowledge of the apparatus that had been discovered, and suggested that whoever had installed it possessed both botanical knowledge and malicious intent, a combination that might point toward any number of suspects. Lady Cassandra's second interview with Poirot occurred as afternoon light was failing, and the household was preparing for another dinner that promised to be uncomfortable. The old lady appeared diminished by the day's events, her determination eroded by fear and exhaustion. She revealed that the Midnight Emperor was not merely a family treasure, but also a potential solution to Sir Edmund's financial crisis. Unknown to most of the family, she had been conducting negotiations with a consortium of botanical gardens that would purchase the plant upon her death, the proceeds to be divided among her descendants. Her opposition to immediate sale stemmed not from pure sentiment, but from determination that the benefit of the sale should flow to Vivian, rather than being consumed by Sir Edmund's creditors. She had summoned Poirot not merely from generalized fear, but from specific knowledge that others were aware of these arrangements and might seek to hasten her death or destroy the plant to prevent the sale's completion. The second dinner proved as tense as anticipated. Conversation occurring in fits and starts, silences growing more prolonged and uncomfortable. Lady Margaret appeared briefly, still pale, but insisting on maintaining appearances, her beauty rendered more poignant by evident distress. She picked at her food without appetite and departed before the meal's conclusion, Dr. Blackwood rising to assist her, with solicitude that suggested his feelings had not been adequately concealed. The evening that followed was marked by nervous energy, people moving restlessly between rooms, conversations beginning and dying without conclusion. Poirot maintained observation from his position by the drawing-room fire, his eyes half closed in meditation that concealed acute attention to the movements and interactions of the household. Shortly before midnight, the tranquility of artificial normalcy was shattered by a scream of such terror that every person in the house responded with immediate movement toward its source. The cry had come from the conservatory, penetrating even the stone walls of the house. Poirot, despite his compact stature, reached the scene with creditable speed, arriving to find Vivian standing in the central pathway, her face white with shock, her arm extended to point toward the Midnight Emperor. The orchid had undergone transformation since morning inspection. The buds had opened partially, revealing blooms of extraordinary beauty and deeply unsettling appearance. The petals were indeed midnight blue, a colour so deep it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was not the flowers themselves that had provoked Vivian's scream. Lying at the base of the plant's pedestal, positioned with unmistakable deliberation, was the body of Mr. Sebastian Vale. The American lay on his back, his eyes open and staring, his face bearing an expression of mingled surprise and resignation. Dr. Blackwood, arriving moments after Poirot, made immediate examination, his professional demeanour firmly in place, despite the shock of discovering death in these circumstances. His pronouncement was delivered with quiet certainty. Vale was dead, and had been for perhaps 30 minutes. The cause of death appeared to be poisoning, though the specific agent could not be determined without post-mortem examination. The symptoms visible on the body suggested something fast-acting and powerful, possibly one of the alkaloid compounds derived from plants themselves. The doctor's expression, as he delivered this assessment, suggested that he recognized the irony of a plant dealer dying among his beloved specimens. Poirot immediately took command of the situation with authority that brooked no argument. The conservatory was to be sealed, nothing touched, police to be summoned at first light, as telephone communication with the village was apparently unreliable at night. All persons present were to provide account of their whereabouts during the preceding hours. The assembly thus constituted included most of the household: Sir Edmund and Lady Cassandra, Arthur Thornfield, Captain Ashford, Vivian herself, and Dr. Blackwood. Lady Margaret remained in her chambers, her indisposition, apparently, genuine enough to excuse her from this grim gathering. Fitzwilliam, the butler, appeared and confirmed that he had been in his pantry throughout the evening and had observed no one entering or leaving the conservatory until Miss Vivian's discovery. The accounts provided by those present revealed a pattern of solitary movements and uncertain alibis. Sir Edmund had been in his study, supposedly reviewing accounts, though he admitted falling asleep at his desk and could not precisely specify when. Lady Cassandra had retired to her chambers early, claiming fatigue, but acknowledged that she had been awake and restless, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Arthur Thornfield had been in the library, selecting books for evening reading, a solitary pursuit without verification. Captain Ashford had taken a walk in the gardens, despite the late hour and cool temperature, seeking clarity of mind through physical exercise. Vivian had gone to the conservatory specifically to check on the orchid, driven by anxiety about the day's tampering and unable to rest without verifying the plant's condition. Dr. Blackwood had been attending to Lady Margaret, administering a mild sedative and remaining with her until she slept, departing her chamber only minutes before the scream sounded. Poirot's examination of the scene was methodical and thorough. He noted the position of the body, the absence of any struggle or defensive wounds, the peaceful expression that suggested death had come, if not welcome, then at least not entirely unexpected. Near Vale's hand lay a small notebook, opened to a page covered with botanical observations written in a precise hand. The final entry, dated that very day, described the Midnight Emperor's progression toward blooming and included calculations regarding the potential chemical composition of the flowers. More significantly, the margin contained a note that suggested Vale had discovered something troubling, a reference to artificial acceleration and degraded cellular structure that implied the orchid had been subjected to chemical intervention beyond the apparatus discovered that morning. The pedestal upon which the orchid rested showed signs of recent disturbance, particles of soil scattered on its surface, suggesting someone had been examining or manipulating the plant's root system. The glass vial and tubing apparatus had been removed, presumably by Dr. Blackwood, for analysis, but marks on the stem indicated where it had been attached. Poirot's attention was caught by a second detail, a small puncture wound on Vale's left hand, barely visible but unmistakable to trained observation. When he drew Dr. Blackwood's attention to this finding, the physician examined it closely and confirmed that it appeared to be a recent injury, possibly from a thorn or similar sharp object. The Midnight Emperor itself bore no thorns, but many of the conservatory's other plants possessed defensive spines. The night that followed was sleepless for all concerned. The conservatory was locked, the key placed in Poirot's possession, the body left in situ until morning would bring both better light and official authority. The household assembled in the drawing room, no one apparently able to contemplate retiring to private chambers under the circumstances. The conversations that occurred were fragmentary and strained, topics raised and abandoned, silences growing longer and heavier. Lady Margaret appeared, summoned by the news, and apparently recovered sufficiently to join the vigil. Her reaction to Vale's death seemed disproportionately strong, her distress manifesting in trembling and tears that suggested either genuine grief or masterful performance. Dr. Blackwood attended her with professional concern, while Lady Cassandra watched this solicitousness with an expression that combined disapproval with something approaching pity. As dawn approached, Poirot requested a final interview with Lady Cassandra, conducted in the privacy of the library, while other household members maintained their uneasy watch. The old lady was exhausted, but maintained composure through force of will that was almost visible. She revealed to Poirot information that cast new light on the entire situation. Mr. Vale's grandfather, the naturalist who had died seeking the Midnight Emperor, had been employed by the first Sir Edmund Thornfield, the man who had won the conservatory at cards. The naturalist had indeed found the orchid in the jungles of Central America, but he had died shortly thereafter, and the orchid had come into Thornfield possession under circumstances that the family had always claimed were legitimate purchase, but which the Vale family had always maintained were theft. Sebastian Vale's obsession with acquiring the plant had roots not merely in scientific interest, but in desire to reclaim what he believed to be rightfully his family's possession. This revelation transformed the murder from mysterious killing to potential revenge tragedy. But it also raised questions that Poirot could not yet answer. If Vale had come seeking justice or recompense, why would someone kill him? And why had someone apparently been attempting to destroy or damage the orchid itself? The little grey cells of Hercule Poirot worked through the night, arranging and rearranging the facts, seeking the pattern that would make sense of events. By the time morning light strengthened sufficiently to permit examination, he had formulated a theory that required testing against evidence. The police arrived mid-morning in the form of Inspector Davies from the County Constabulary, a competent man who demonstrated admirable willingness to defer to Poirot's expertise while maintaining appropriate official authority. The examination of the conservatory in daylight revealed details that darkness had concealed. The source of Vale's fatal poisoning became apparent through careful observation of the scene. Among the many exotic plants in the collection was a specimen of Aconitum ferox, commonly known as Indian aconite or bic, a plant whose roots contained some of the most potent toxins known to botanical science. Someone with knowledge of plants could have extracted alkaloid poison from this specimen, a process requiring neither sophisticated equipment nor extensive time. More significantly, examination of the Midnight Emperor itself revealed that the earlier tempering had been more extensive than initially apparent. The plant had been subjected to a complex chemical treatment designed to force premature blooming. But the preparation used had been applied with such precision that it suggested intimate knowledge of orchid cultivation. The timing of the application suggested it had occurred not during the night when the vile apparatus was discovered, but earlier, possibly even before the weekend gathering had commenced. The person responsible had needed access to the conservatory over an extended period and familiarity with both the plant's requirements and the environmental control systems. The questioning of household members proceeded through the morning, Inspector Davies conducting formal interviews, while Poirot observed with eyes that missed nothing. Contradictions emerged between accounts, small discrepancies that individually meant little, but collectively suggested that several persons were concealing information. Sir Edmund's debts proved even more desperate than he had initially admitted, his creditors being persons who did not accept delay or negotiate payment terms. Arthur Thornfield's bohemian lifestyle masked a dependence on substances that required regular funding and drove increasingly desperate behaviour. Captain Ashford's gambling history included debts to persons who had been known to enforce payment through extreme measures. Lady Margaret's sleeping draught had been obtained not from Dr. Blackwood, but from a London chemist, the prescription forged, suggesting both deception and possible addiction. It was Vivian, however, whose interview provided the key that unlocked the mystery. Under gentle but persistent questioning from Poirot, she revealed that her engagement to Captain Ashford had occurred with suspicious rapidity after another suitor had been rejected. This previous suitor, whom she declined to name initially, had been someone close to the family, someone whose proposal she had refused because she suspected his motives were financial rather than romantic. When Poirot pressed for identification, Vivian dissolved into tears and confessed. Dr. Blackwood had proposed marriage to her 6 months previous. a proposal she had declined with as much kindness as possible, but which the physician had apparently not accepted as final. This revelation cast new light on Dr. Blackwood's continued presence in the household and his particular attentiveness to the female members of the Thornfield family. Further investigation revealed that the physician's financial circumstances were considerably less stable than his professional standing suggested. Poor investments and expensive habits had eroded his capital, and a prosperous marriage would solve problems that his practice income could not address. His attention to Lady Margaret appeared less like professional concern and more like calculated cultivation of an alternative prospect, should Vivian prove unobtainable. The sleeping draughts he had prescribed to Lady Margaret had indeed been mild, but someone had substituted stronger preparations, possibly hoping to create dependence that would lead to marriage. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place when examination of Dr. Blackwood's medical bag revealed traces of aconite alkaloid, the same poison that had killed Vale. The physician initially protested that the presence of such substances was normal for a medical practice, that aconite preparations were used in various treatments. But Poirot, employing the psychological insight that was his particular genius, challenged this explanation with a reconstruction of events that was both logical and devastating. Dr. Blackwood had indeed killed Sebastian Vale, but not for the obvious reasons that initial evidence suggested. The true motive emerged from the physician's examination of the glass vial apparatus that had been attached to the orchid. Analysis of the residual liquid had revealed not just plant accelerant, but also trace amounts of cardiac glycosides, compounds that in sufficient concentration would cause symptoms indistinguishable from heart failure. Dr. Blackwood had recognized these compounds because he had employed them himself 50 years previous, when he had been a young physician recently joined to the Thornfield family's service. He had killed the first Sir Edmund in the conservatory, poisoning him with substances that had left no trace detectable by the forensic methods of the time. The motive had been both professional and personal. Sir Edmund had discovered irregularities in the physician's conduct and threatened exposure that would destroy Blackwood's career. Sebastian Vale, through his grandfather's papers and his own botanical expertise, had uncovered evidence of this historical crime. The apparatus he had attached to the orchid was not intended to damage the plant, but to extract soil samples that might still retain traces of the original poisoning. Vale had planned to expose Blackwood's crime, seeking justice for the Vale family, while simultaneously discrediting the Thornfield ownership of the orchid. When Blackwood discovered what Vale was attempting, he had acted with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had killed before and was prepared to kill again to protect his secrets. The murder itself had been accomplished through the simple method of poisoning Vale's evening coffee with aconite extract, the poison acting within minutes of consumption. The physician's collapse when confronted with this reconstruction was complete and somewhat pitiful. He confessed not only to Vale's murder, but to the historical killing of Sir Edmund Thornfield, motivated then, as now, by desperation to conceal professional misconduct and personal failings. His subsequent campaign to marry into the Thornfield family had been driven partly by guilt and partly by calculation, seeking to bind himself to the family he had wronged, while also securing financial stability. The attempts on Vivian's life, which investigation confirmed had indeed been deliberate, had been motivated by rage at her rejection and determination to prevent her marriage to anyone else. If he could not have the Thornfield fortune through Vivian, he would at least prevent its passing to Captain Ashford. The arrest of Dr. Blackwood brought relief to some members of the household, and consternation to others. Lady Margaret's distress at the revelation of her physician's crimes suggested that his attentions had not been entirely unwelcome, a possibility that Lady Cassandra observed with grim satisfaction. The old lady's own relief was tempered by the knowledge that the family's most celebrated possession, the Midnight Emperor, had been cultivated in soil enriched by crime and concealment. She announced her intention to donate the plant to a botanical institution as soon as arrangements could be made, declaring that the Thornfield family had possessed it long enough and at too high a cost. The blooming of the Midnight Emperor reached its peak on the day following Blackwood's arrest, the 3 magnificent flowers opening fully to reveal beauty that transcended the circumstances of their cultivation. The blooms were indeed midnight blue, but they also possessed iridescent qualities that created shifting colours as light struck them from different angles. Purple and silver, indigo and green, all interweaving in patterns that seemed almost to pulse with life. Poirot was permitted to view them in private company with Lady Cassandra and Vivian, the 3 standing in silence before the plant that had catalysed so much tragedy. Poirot's departure from Thornfield Manor occurred 3 days after the orchid's peak bloom, the flowers already beginning to fade, their brief moment of glory passing into memory. Lady Cassandra accompanied him to the motor car, her manner combining gratitude with the reserve appropriate to her station. She inquired whether Poirot believed in curses or supernatural protection, whether the orchid had somehow avenged the crimes committed in its presence. Poirot's response was characteristic. He believed in human wickedness and human justice, in the capacity of the mind to uncover truth through application of reason and method. The orchid was merely a plant, beautiful and rare, but possessing no agency beyond its biological imperative to bloom and reproduce. The true curse had been human greed and the willingness to commit murder to satisfy it. The morning following. Blackwood's arrest brought an unexpected development that threatened to complicate matters considerably. Inspector Davies arrived at Thornfield Manor with news that the physician had retracted his confession during the night, claiming that it had been extracted under psychological duress and that he was innocent of all charges. This reversal, while not unprecedented in criminal investigations, required that the case be reconstructed with additional rigour, the evidence assembled in fashion that would withstand judicial scrutiny. Poirot received this information with equanimity that bordered on satisfaction, remarking to the inspector that a criminal's second thoughts often revealed more than his initial admissions. The detective requested permission to conduct additional interviews and examinations, permission that Davies granted with alacrity, recognising that Poirot's methods, though unorthodox, produced results that could be presented in courtroom with devastating effect. The first person Poirot sought for re-examination was Fitzwilliam, the butler, whose position in the household granted him knowledge of movements and habits that other servants might not possess. The butler received Poirot in his pantry, a domain of silver and crystal maintained with meticulous order that suggested a mind comfortable with precision and routine. Fitzwilliam proved to be a man of considerable intelligence, concealed beneath the professional demeanour of upper servant, and his observations of the household over the past decade revealed patterns that casual visitors would never detect. He confirmed that Dr. Blackwood had indeed been a frequent visitor to Thornfield Manor long before the current crisis, his attendance on the family extending back to the time of the first Sir Edmund's death. The physician's relationship with the late baronet had been complex, professional respect mixed with personal tension arising from Sir Edmund's suspicions regarding Blackwood's treatment of other patients. More significantly, Fitzwilliam revealed that the conservatory had been the site of other incidents over the years. events that had never been adequately explained. 3 separate gardeners had resigned their positions after experiencing what they described as inexplicable illness while working among the plants. Symptoms that ranged from vertigo and nausea to more severe reactions, including temporary paralysis and respiratory distress. These incidents had been attributed to allergic reactions or natural plant toxins, but Fitzwilliam's account suggested a pattern of experimentation, as though someone had been testing various substances and methods within the controlled environment of the conservatory. The timing of these incidents corresponded roughly to periods when Dr. Blackwood had been particularly attentive to the family, suggesting that the physician had been using the conservatory as an informal laboratory for his more questionable researches. Armed with this information, Poirot requested access to the conservatory's record books, documents that tracked the acquisition and cultivation of specimens over the decades. These ledgers, maintained with Victorian thoroughness, revealed that the collection of potentially toxic plants had increased significantly following the first Sir Edmund's death, with particular emphasis on species containing cardiac glycosides, alkaloids, and other compounds with medicinal or toxic properties. The justification recorded for these acquisitions was always scientific or aesthetic, but the pattern suggested purpose beyond mere botanical interest. Cross-referencing these additions with Dr. Blackwood's visits to the manor revealed correlation that approached certainty. The physician had been systematically building a collection of poisonous plants under guise of contributing to the family's horticultural reputation. The investigation into the historical crime deepened when Poirot requested examination of documents from the time of the first Sir Edmund's death. Lady Cassandra, despite her age and the emotional toll of recent events, proved invaluable in locating papers that had been stored in the manor's archives. Among these documents was a diary kept by the late Sir Edmund during the final months of his life, a record that revealed growing concern about Dr. Blackwood's professional conduct. The entries described incidents where the physician had prescribed treatments that seemed unnecessarily aggressive or employed substances whose effects appeared uncertain. More damningly, Sir Edmund had recorded his intention to consult with medical authorities in London regarding several cases where Blackwood's patients had experienced unexpected deterioration or death, circumstances that the family physician attributed to the natural progression of disease, but which struck the baronet as suspicious. The diary entries ceased abruptly 3 days before Sir Edmund's death, the final notation expressing an intention to confront Blackwood with these concerns and demand explanation. The inference was clear. The physician, learning of Sir Edmund's suspicions and his plan to seek outside investigation, had acted with desperate urgency to silence his accuser. The method had been both clever and audacious, employing the very conservatory that Sir Edmund loved to stage a death that would appear natural. The cardiac glycosides extracted from digitalis plants in the collection would produce symptoms indistinguishable from heart failure, especially in a man of Sir Edmund's age and constitution. The location of the death, surrounded by exotic plants in the humid atmosphere of the conservatory, would discourage extensive investigation, as collapse in such environment would seem unsurprising. Poirot's reconstruction of the historical murder gained additional support when examination of the conservatory's soil revealed trace elements consistent with the presence of cardiac glycosides at levels far exceeding what would naturally occur from cultivation of digitalis specimens. Modern analytical techniques, unavailable in the 1870s, could detect these compounds decades after their introduction, providing physical evidence to support the theoretical reconstruction. When presented with this finding, Dr. Blackwood's defense collapsed entirely, the physician acknowledging that scientific progress had made concealment impossible, where it had once seemed permanent. His renewed confession included details of the original crime that only the killer could have known, removing any doubt about his guilt in the matter of the first Sir Edmund's death. The question of Sebastian Vale's murder required separate consideration, as the circumstances differed substantially from the historical crime. Poirot's investigation revealed that Vale had indeed discovered evidence of the original murder through combination of his grandfather's papers and his own chemical analysis of soil samples from the conservatory. The naturalist grandfather, dying of fever in Central America, had left journals describing his discovery of the Midnight Emperor and his arrangements with Sir Edmund Thornfield for the plant's transport to England. These journals also contained observations about the conservatory's construction and plant collection, details that had allowed Sebastian Vale to identify specific specimens that should not have been present in a purely ornamental collection. The presence of multiple highly toxic species, all acquired after the grandfather's death, had suggested to Vale that something sinister had occurred. Vale's investigation had been methodical and scientific, employing modern analytical techniques to examine soil samples obtained during his visits to Thornfield Manor. His discovery of cardiac glycosides in concentrations that exceeded natural accumulation had led him to review the circumstances of the first Sir Edmund's death, finding in contemporary newspaper accounts and medical records evidence that supported suspicion of poisoning. His intention had been to expose this historical crime publicly, both to obtain justice for murder and to challenge the Thornfield family's right to possess an orchid that his grandfather had discovered and that had, in Vale's view, been obtained through circumstances tainted by subsequent criminality. The apparatus he had attached to the plant was indeed designed to extract additional soil samples for analysis, providing evidence that could be presented to authorities. Dr. Blackwood's discovery of Vale's investigation had occurred by accident, the physician noticing during his examination of Lady Margaret that she possessed correspondence from Vale outlining his theories and evidence. Lady Margaret, it transpired, had been conducting her own inquiry into family history, motivated by curiosity about her husband's ancestors and the origins of the family's celebrated orchid collection. Her communication with Vale had been innocent, driven by intellectual interest rather than suspicious intent, but it had alerted Blackwood to the danger he faced. The physician's decision to eliminate Vale had been made with cold calculation, recognizing that exposure of the historical murder would destroy not only his reputation, but also his freedom, as there was no statute of limitations on murder, regardless of how much time had elapsed. The method of Vale's murder demonstrated both Blackwood's medical knowledge and his familiarity with the conservatory's plant collection. Aconite poisoning was particularly suitable for his purposes, as the symptoms developed rapidly and the toxic compounds, while detectable post-mortem, required specific testing that might not be performed if the death appeared to result from natural causes or accident. The physician had extracted alkaloids from the Indian aconite specimen in the collection, a process requiring some expertise, but well within his capabilities. The poison had been administered in Vale's evening coffee, which Blackwood had personally prepared and delivered to the American's room earlier in the evening, expressing concern about Vale's agitated state and offering a sedative to help him sleep. Vale, trusting the physician and perhaps already feeling unwell from nervous strain, had consumed the poisoned beverage without suspicion. The staging of the death in the conservatory had been opportunistic rather than planned, Blackwood taking advantage of Vale's nocturnal habits and obsessive interest in the Midnight Emperor to position the body where it would be discovered in circumstances that would create maximum confusion. The physician had followed Vale to the conservatory, knowing from observation that the American made frequent nighttime visits to check on the orchid's progress. Finding Vale already dead or dying from the poison's effects, Blackwood had arranged the body at the base of the plant's pedestal, creating a tableau that suggested the man had expired while making observations. The puncture wound on Vale's hand had been inflicted post-mortem, Blackwood deliberately pricking the skin with a thorn from a nearby plant to suggest that Vale might have accidentally poisoned himself through contact with toxic vegetation. This reconstruction, when presented to Dr. Blackwood in the presence of Inspector Davis and legal counsel, produced a confession that was both comprehensive and deeply self-serving. The physician portrayed himself as victim of circumstances, a man driven to desperate measures by the combination of medical duty, personal affection for the Thornfield family, and fear of unjust persecution for actions that had been, in his telling, motivated by mercy rather than malice. The first Sir Edmund, he claimed, had been suffering from a painful and progressive disease that would have led to agonizing death over months or years. The administration of cardiac glycosides had been an act of euthanasia, providing peaceful release from inevitable suffering. That this mercy killing had coincidentally occurred when Sir Edmund was preparing to investigate Blackwood's professional conduct was, the physician suggested, an unfortunate timing that had no causal connection. Poirot's response to this self-justifying narrative was delivered with the quiet authority that made him formidable in such moments. He observed that murderers throughout history had excused their crimes through claims of benevolent motivation, that the taking of human life was no less criminal when dressed in garments of mercy, and that Dr. Blackwood's pattern of behaviour demonstrated not compassion, but ruthless self-interest. The physician's subsequent crimes, including the attempts on Vivian's life and the murder of Sebastian Vale, could not be explained through any appeal to medical ethics or noble purpose. They were simply the actions of a man willing to kill repeatedly to conceal his original crime and to satisfy his desire for financial security through mercenary marriage. The revelation of Blackwood's guilt and the details of his various crimes produced varied reactions among the Thornfield household. Sir Edmund expressed relief mixed with horror, gratitude that his family had been delivered from danger, combined with distress at learning that a man he had trusted with the health of his household had been a murderer, residing among them for decades. Lady Cassandra displayed the stoic dignity that had sustained her through previous crises, accepting the vindication of her long-held suspicions about her husband's death, while acknowledging that such knowledge came too late to provide meaningful justice. Lady Margaret descended into prostration that required medical attention from a physician summoned from London, her distress suggesting that Blackwood's attentions had been more welcome than she had previously admitted, and that his betrayal of her trust represented personal as well as general catastrophe. Vivian's reaction proved most complex and in some ways most mature. She acknowledged to Poirot in private conversation that Blackwood's proposal of marriage, which she had rejected, had been accompanied by subtle threats regarding the accidents that had endangered her life. The physician had never explicitly claimed responsibility for these incidents, but his hints had been sufficient to create atmosphere of fear that had driven Vivian into Captain Ashford's arms more from desperation than genuine affection. The exposure of Blackwood's criminality freed her from this coercion, allowing her to reconsider her engagement with clear mind and honest assessment of her feelings. Her decision, announced several days after Blackwood's arrest, was to postpone the wedding indefinitely. A choice that Captain Ashford received with more relief than disappointment, suggesting that his own motivations for the match had been less romantic than pragmatic. The disposition of the Midnight Emperor became matter of extended negotiation among various interested parties. The botanical gardens that Lady Cassandra had been considering for the plant's eventual home expressed strong interest in immediate acquisition, offering terms that would provide substantial benefit to the Thornfield family while ensuring the orchid's preservation and scientific study. However, Sebastian Vale's family, represented by lawyers who materialized with impressive speed after news of the murder reached America, filed claim to the plant based on the grandfather's discovery and alleged theft by the first Sir Edmund. This legal action threatened to entangle the orchid in litigation that could extend for years, the plant itself potentially languishing in neglect while courts determined ownership. Poirot's intervention in this dispute took the form of mediation rather than investigation, his reputation and persuasive powers being employed to negotiate settlement that satisfied all parties while ensuring the orchid's welfare. The agreement eventually reached provided that the Midnight Emperor would be donated to a consortium of botanical institutions, with the understanding that Sebastian Vale's grandfather would be credited as discoverer, and that a portion of any revenue generated by the plant through seeds, cultivation, or other commercial means would be paid to the Vale family in perpetuity. The Thornfield family would retain certain rights of visitation and consultation, acknowledging their role in preserving and cultivating the specimen, while accepting that their moral claim to ownership had been compromised by the criminal circumstances surrounding its acquisition and retention. The blooming of the Midnight Emperor, which continued for nearly a week, became an event of scientific as well as aesthetic significance. Botanists from several institutions arrived to document the phenomenon, their photographs and descriptions ensuring that this rare occurrence would be preserved for study even after the flowers faded. The blooms themselves proved even more remarkable upon close examination than initial viewing had suggested. The midnight blue coloration resulted from pigments that had never been precisely documented in orchid species, combinations of anthocyanins and other compounds that created effects bordering on the structural rather than purely chemical. The flowers also produced fragrance that defied simple description, combining floral sweetness with notes of vanilla, spice, and something almost mineral. A scent that seemed to vary depending on time of day and atmospheric conditions. The scientific examination of the plant revealed that Sebastian Vale's concerns about its treatment had been justified. The chemical acceleration that had forced the premature blooming had indeed compromised the plant's cellular structure, and expert opinion suggested that the Midnight Emperor might not survive to bloom again in another 50 years. This knowledge cast shadow over the magnificence of the flowers, rendering them both more precious for their rarity and more poignant for representing possibly the final expression of a genetic line that had survived for centuries. The botanists present spoke of attempts to propagate the plant through tissue culture and other modern techniques, hoping to preserve its unique characteristics, even if the original specimen could not be saved. But success in such endeavours remained uncertain. As Poirot prepared for his departure from Thornfield Manor, now delayed by more than a week from his original intention, he found himself reflecting on the various strands of human nature that the case had revealed. The capacity for murder, he had long understood, existed in many persons under sufficient pressure of circumstance and motive. What interested him more particularly in this instance was the intersection of beauty and corruption, the way that the exquisite Midnight Emperor had become focal point for crimes spanning 5 decades. The orchid itself was innocent, simply following its biological imperatives. Yet it had catalyzed human greed, deception, and violence in ways that seemed almost to justify the superstitious notion of cursed objects. The truth, as Poirot understood it, was that humans cursed themselves through their actions, and objects became repositories of guilt and consequence only through the meanings invested in them by human consciousness. Lady Cassandra's final conversation with Poirot took place in the conservatory itself, the old lady having requested this location for their farewell, despite the painful associations it now held. She stood before the Midnight Emperor, examining the flowers with expression that combined sadness and satisfaction, mourning the circumstances of their blooming, while acknowledging their undeniable beauty. She thanked Poirot for his services with dignity that precluded effusive gratitude, remarking that he had provided not just solution to immediate mysteries, but also resolution of questions that had troubled her for half a century. The knowledge of her husband's murder, though painful, was preferable to uncertainty and unsubstantiated suspicion. She could now mourn him properly, acknowledging the crime done to him, rather than accepting the official story of natural death. Poirot responded with observations about justice and truth, themes that often occupied his thoughts in the aftermath of successful investigations. He noted that legal justice would be served through Dr. Blackwood's prosecution and punishment, but that other forms of justice, more subtle and personal, had also been achieved. The Vale family's claim to recognition and compensation addressed historical injustice, even if it could not restore the grandfather who had died in pursuit of his botanical passion. Vivian's escape from coerced marriage represented justice of personal liberation, freedom from manipulation and threat. Even the orchid itself, in being removed from private possession and placed in institutional care, received a form of justice, its beauty and scientific significance made available to wider world rather than being hoarded by single family. The question of whether the Thornfield family would recover from the multiple scandals and revelations remained uncertain. Sir Edmund's financial difficulties persisted, though the settlement regarding the orchid provided some relief, and the publicity surrounding the case had, paradoxically, increased interest in the estate among potential visitors and botanical enthusiasts. Lady Cassandra spoke of opening the conservatory to public on limited basis, generating revenue while sharing the collection that had been assembled over generations. This democratization of beauty struck Poirot as appropriate conclusion to a case that had exposed the dangers of private possession and secretive conduct. Transparency and accessibility, though not guarantees against human wickedness, at least, made such wickedness more difficult to conceal and maintain. Arthur Thornfield, whose role in the drama had been largely peripheral, surprised everyone by announcing his intention to write a book about the Midnight Emperor and the crimes associated with it. His literary ambitions, previously directed toward poetry of questionable merit, would find more suitable outlet in narrative non-fiction, and his insider knowledge of the family and events gave him material that no outside writer could match. Lady Cassandra expressed resignation regarding this project, noting that the family's story would become public knowledge regardless of whether Arthur wrote it, and that at least a family member might present events with some degree of accuracy and sympathy. Poirot privately suspected that Arthur's account would be sensationalized and dramatic, but he acknowledged that the case possessed sufficient inherent drama to survive even mediocre literary treatment. The physical departure from Thornfield Manor occurred on a morning of unusual clarity, autumn sunlight rendering the Golden Conservatory even more spectacular than Poirot's first viewing of it. The structure gleamed against blue sky, its golden framework and glass panels creating effects of light and transparency that seemed almost ethereal. Poirot permitted himself a moment of aesthetic appreciation before entering the motorcar that would carry him to the railway station. His cases, precisely packed by his manservant who had joined him for the latter portion of his stay, were arranged with characteristic order. His person was, as always, immaculately groomed, his moustaches waxed to perfection, his suit brushed and pressed to military standards. The journey back to London provided opportunity for reflection on the case and its various elements. Poirot's mind, methodical even in contemplation, arranged the facts and deductions in orderly fashion, examining them for lessons that might be applied to future investigations. The importance of patience in allowing evidence to accumulate rather than rushing to premature conclusions. The value of listening to elderly persons whose long experience of situations and people provided context that younger observers lacked. The necessity of examining historical crimes when present events suggested patterns of behavior extending across time. The recognition that some objects, whether through inherent value or symbolic significance, catalyzed human behavior in ways that transcended their material nature. The Midnight Emperor, in particular, occupied Poirot's thoughts. The orchid had been simultaneously object of beauty, scientific curiosity, financial asset, family symbol, and catalyst for murder. Its 50-year blooming cycle had created temporal framework that connected past and present crimes. The first Sir Edmund's murder and Sebastian Vale's death, separated by decades, but linked through the plant's extraordinary biology. The notion that natural processes could provide structure for human drama appealed to Poirot's sense of order and pattern. The little grey cells appreciated symmetry, even in circumstances where symmetry arose from tragic coincidence rather than deliberate design. Back in his London flat, surrounded by familiar comforts and the orderly arrangements that reflected his personal preferences, Poirot documented the case with thoroughness that characterized all his professional work. The written account would join others in his archives, a record not just of criminal investigation, but of human nature in its various manifestations. The file on the Thornfield case would include not only facts and deductions, but also observations about family dynamics, the corrosive effects of financial pressure, the dangers of unchecked professional authority, and the complex relationships between beauty, value, and violence. Inspector Davies, in his official report to the county authorities, acknowledged Poirot's contribution with generosity that the Belgian detective found gratifying. The inspector noted that without Poirot's insights and methodical investigation, Dr. Blackwood would likely have escaped justice for both historical and recent murders, the evidence being circumstantial and the alternative explanations plausible enough to create reasonable doubt. The physician's eventual conviction would rest on combination of physical evidence, documentary proof, and confession, elements that Poirot's investigation had either uncovered or precipitated. Justice, though delayed by 5 decades in the case of the first murder, would ultimately be served. The newspapers, inevitably, made sensation of the case, their accounts emphasizing the Gothic elements of conservatory murders and poisonous plants, while largely ignoring the methodical investigative work that had produced resolution. Poirot read these articles with mild amusement, accustomed to journalistic distortion, and recognizing that public appetite for dramatic narrative exceeded interest in detective methodology. One article in particular caught his attention, a piece that described the Midnight Emperor as cursed orchid, whose beauty had brought death to all who sought to possess it. Poirot permitted himself a small sound of disapproval at this interpretation, understanding that some persons would always prefer supernatural explanations to the more disturbing truth of human capacity for evil. Letters arrived from various members of the Thornfield family in the weeks following the case's conclusion, each expressing gratitude in characteristic fashion. Lady Cassandra's note was brief and formal, acknowledging debt while maintaining aristocratic reserve. Vivian wrote with greater warmth, describing her relief at escaping both physical danger and emotional manipulation, and noting that she was using her freedom to reconsider her life's direction with clarity previously unavailable to her. Even Sir Edmund managed a letter, his prose suggesting that the removal of financial pressure and family secrets had allowed recovery of dignity that recent years had eroded. Arthur's communication was longest and most literary, filled with quotations and philosophical observations that Poirot found simultaneously pretentious and oddly touching. The fate of Dr. Blackwood followed predictable course through judicial system. The physician's trial became a major news event, attracting observers from medical, legal, and general public communities. The evidence presented was overwhelming, combining modern forensic analysis with historical documentation and the defendant's own confessions. Blackwood's attorneys attempted defense based on diminished capacity and medical ethics, arguing that the original killing had been euthanasia rather than murder, and that subsequent actions had resulted from psychological breakdown rather than criminal intent. The jury, unmoved by these arguments, returned guilty verdicts on all counts after brief deliberation. The sentence pronounced by the judge reflected both the severity of the crimes and the betrayal of professional trust they represented. Life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The botanical legacy of the case proved more complex and ultimately more hopeful than the criminal proceedings. The Midnight Emperor, despite the damage inflicted by chemical acceleration, survived and eventually stabilized under expert care at the botanical institution that became its permanent home. The propagation attempts succeeded beyond initial expectations, tissue culture techniques producing multiple genetic copies that would ensure preservation of the plant's unique characteristics. These cultivated specimens would bloom on more frequent schedule than the original, allowing study and appreciation without waiting 50-year intervals. The Vale family, receiving recognition and financial compensation, expressed satisfaction that their grandfather's work would be remembered and honoured. Poirot's own assessment of the case, confided to his friend Hastings during a dinner conversation several months after the investigation's conclusion, emphasized the human elements that had interested him most particularly. The case had not been primarily about the orchid, despite its central role, but rather about the ways that value, whether monetary or symbolic, distorted human relationships and motivated destructive behavior. Dr. Blackwood had killed repeatedly to protect secrets and secure financial future, destroying lives to maintain comfortable existence. The Thornfield family had hoarded a treasure that might have been shared, allowing private possession to create vulnerability to exploitation and crime. Sebastian Vale had pursued justice and vindication to point where it cost him his life, his grandfather's legacy becoming instrument of his destruction. The lessons Poirot extracted from these observations were both specific and general. Specifically, the case demonstrated importance of transparency in professional conduct, necessity of financial security that did not depend on criminal activity, and danger of allowing objects to become symbols laden with excessive meaning. More generally, the investigation confirmed Poirot's understanding of human nature as fundamentally consistent across time and circumstance. The motives that had driven Dr. Blackwood to murder in 1870 and again in the present were essentially identical. Fear of exposure, desire for financial security, and willingness to destroy others to preserve self. The methods available for such destruction had evolved with scientific progress, but the underlying psychology remained constant. The Golden Conservatory itself continued to attract visitors after the scandal, though the nature of this attention shifted from purely botanical interest to include darker curiosity about crime and violence. The Thornfield family's decision to open the structure to public viewing proved financially successful, admission fees providing income that helped stabilize the estate's precarious finances. Guides, hired to conduct tours, emphasized both the botanical wonders and the historical events, creating narrative that satisfied various audience interests. Poirot, who visited the conservatory once more some years after the case's conclusion, found this commercialization slightly melancholy, but recognized it as inevitable consequence of notoriety. The plants, at least, seemed indifferent to human drama, continuing their growth and blooming according to biological imperatives that preceded and would outlast the crimes committed in their presence. The final chapter in the case of the Midnight Emperor occurred nearly a decade after the original investigation, when Poirot received news of Lady Cassandra's death at the advanced age of 87. The intervening years had seen profound changes in the Thornfield family's circumstances and in the broader world's understanding of the case that had briefly made them objects of public fascination. The trial of Dr. Blackwood had been conducted with meticulous attention to legal procedure, the prosecution presenting case built on physical evidence, documentary proof, and expert testimony that made conviction inevitable, despite the physician's retraction of his confession. The proceedings had lasted 3 weeks, during which every aspect of Blackwood's long career of exploitation and murder had been examined with thoroughness that left no room for reasonable doubt. The courtroom testimony had revealed details that had not emerged during Poirot's initial investigation, witnesses coming forward to describe incidents that, when placed in context of Blackwood's broader pattern of criminality, suggested even more extensive victimization than had been originally suspected. Former patients and their families testified to treatments that had seemed unnecessarily aggressive, medications that had produced unexpected symptoms, and deaths that had occurred under circumstances that raised questions never adequately addressed. The cumulative weight of this testimony created a portrait of a physician who had systematically abused his position of trust over a period of decades, using medical knowledge not to heal, but to exploit, and ultimately to kill when exploitation was threatened with exposure. The defense attempted to portray Blackwood as dedicated medical professional, driven to temporary aberration by combination of financial pressure and emotional attachment to the Thornfield family, arguing that the murders had been crimes of passion rather than calculated acts of a serial predator. This narrative was systematically dismantled by prosecution witnesses, who demonstrated that the physician's crimes had been characterized by careful planning, methodical execution, and consistent pattern of behavior that extended across half a century. The forensic evidence regarding the poisonings, presented by experts in toxicology and forensic pathology, established that the doses employed had been precisely calculated to ensure death, while minimizing detection, demonstrating medical sophistication inconsistent with acts committed in heat of passion or under emotional duress. Poirot himself had testified for 2 full days, his account of the investigation delivered with characteristic precision and attention to detail that held jury's attention despite technical complexity of some material. He had described the process by which he had identified Dr. Blackwood as suspect, the accumulation of evidence, both physical and psychological, that had pointed toward physician's guilt, and the logical deductions that had allowed reconstruction of crimes separated by 5 decades, but linked through consistent methodology and motive. The defense's attempt to discredit Poirot's testimony through questioning his credentials or methods had proven spectacularly unsuccessful. The Belgian detective's reputation and demonstrated expertise making him unassailable witness, whose conclusions carried weight that no amount of hostile cross-examination could diminish. The jury's deliberations had been brief, lasting less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The foreman's voice had been steady as he pronounced the verdicts, but the solemnity of the occasion had been apparent in the silence that followed each pronouncement. Dr. Blackwood had received the verdicts without visible emotion, his face maintaining professional composure that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial. Only when the judge pronounced sentence, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, had the physician's facade cracked slightly. A brief expression of something that might have been despair, or perhaps merely fatigue, crossing his features before professional mask reasserted itself. The years following the trial had brought various consequences for the persons involved in the case. Sir Edmund Thornfield had used the settlement funds from the Midnight Emperor's disposition to address his most pressing debts, though complete financial rehabilitation had required sale of portions of the estate and adoption of economy measures that had gradually eroded the family's social position. He had died 5 years after the trial, his health undermined by years of dissipation and stress, leaving Thornfield Manor to Vivian, who had never married and who had devoted herself to managing the estate with competence that her father had never demonstrated. The conservatory had become her particular project, the Golden Conservatory being transformed from private family possession into botanical resource of regional significance. Its collections enhanced and its public accessibility increased. Arthur Thornfield had indeed written his book about the Midnight Emperor and the associated crimes, though the published volume had proven more substantial and thoughtful than Poirot had anticipated. The younger Thornfield brother had conquered his dependence on laudanum through combination of medical treatment and iron will, the crisis precipitated by his brother's near ruin apparently providing motivation for personal reform that previous attempts had lacked. His account of the family's ordeal, while certainly dramatic in places, had demonstrated genuine literary merit, and had achieved both critical respect and commercial success. The royalties had provided Arthur with financial independence that freed him from need to maintain pretense of artistic bohemianism, allowing him to pursue more genuine creative interests that had resulted in several volumes of poetry that, while not widely read, had garnered respect from serious critics. Lady Margaret had survived her husband by only 2 years, her death resulting from combination of physical illness and what appeared to be loss of will to continue living after the dual shocks of Blackwood's betrayal and Sir Edmund's decline. She had spent her final months in quiet retirement in London, avoiding society and maintaining contact with only a few close friends, who respected her desire for privacy. Her beauty, which had been her primary asset throughout her life, had faded rapidly in these final years, as though the removal of need to maintain appearances had eliminated motivation for the cosmetic efforts that had previously sustained illusion of ageless elegance. Her death had been peaceful, and Poirot, who had attended the funeral out of respect, had reflected that she had perhaps found in death the peace that had eluded her during life. Captain Ashford had returned to military service after the broken engagement, volunteering for colonial postings that took him far from England and the memories of his failed matrimonial schemes. Reports reaching London suggested that he had distinguished himself in several minor campaigns, his bravery in combat apparently being genuine, even if his character in other respects had proven deficient. Whether distance and military discipline would produce lasting reform remained uncertain, but at minimum, the captain had avoided falling into deeper criminal behavior that might have resulted from continued association with the gambling establishments and moneylenders who had held his debts. Vivian had received occasional letters from him in subsequent years, apologetic communications that suggested genuine regret for his role in the affair, and acknowledgement that the broken engagement had been fortunate for both parties. The botanical legacy of the case had proven more enduring and positive than the human consequences. The Midnight Emperor, despite concerns about damage from chemical acceleration, had not only survived, but had produced seeds that had allowed propagation of the species beyond the single specimen that had resided at Thornfield Manor for so many decades. The tissue culture techniques employed by botanical institutions had created population of genetic copies that ensured preservation of the plant's unique characteristics, while traditional seed propagation had introduced slight variations that might eventually lead to new varieties with different blooming cycles or coloration. The original plant, now elderly by orchid standards, continued to reside in the botanical garden that had become its permanent home, though its subsequent bloomings had been less spectacular than the event that had occurred during Poirot's investigation. The Vale family's vindication had brought satisfaction that transcended financial compensation, though the royalties from orchid propagation had certainly provided material benefit that improved their circumstances. Sebastian Vale's widow, whom Poirot had met during the trial, had been a woman of dignity and grace, who had expressed gratitude for the detective's work in exposing her husband's murder, while acknowledging that justice, however well served, could not restore what had been lost. She had established foundation in her husband's name to support botanical research and exploration, ensuring that his passion for plant science would continue to bear fruit, even though his own life had been cut short. The foundation had sponsored several successful expeditions to Central and South America, discovering numerous new species and contributing to scientific understanding of tropical ecosystems. The conservatory itself had undergone restoration and enhancement in the years following the case, Vivian's stewardship ensuring that the structure's Victorian magnificence was maintained, while modern environmental controls were installed to provide better protection for the plant collections. The tours that had begun as necessity for generating income had evolved into educational programs that attracted serious botanical students as well as casual visitors interested in the building's architectural beauty and historical associations. The guides who conducted these tours had been instructed to present the conservatory's history honestly, including the criminal events that had occurred there, but to emphasize the botanical significance and educational value of the collections, rather than dwelling excessively on sensational details of murder and poison. Poirot's own relationship with the case had evolved over the years from active investigation to periodic reflection on the lessons it had provided regarding human nature, criminal psychology, and the methods by which truth could be extracted from webs of deception and concealment. He had employed techniques developed during the Thornfield investigation in subsequent cases. His understanding of how professional positions could be exploited for criminal purposes, proving valuable in exposing physicians, lawyers, and other trusted figures who had abused their authority for personal gain. The case had also reinforced his conviction that patient accumulation of detail, combined with rigorous logical analysis, would ultimately reveal truth, regardless of how carefully criminals attempted to conceal their actions. The watercolour painting of the Midnight Emperor that Lady Cassandra had bequeathed to Poirot had become one of his most prized possessions, not for its monetary value, which was minimal, but for its representation of the case's central themes and its reminder of the old lady's strength and determination. The painting depicted the orchid at peak bloom, the three magnificent flowers rendered with botanical accuracy combined with artistic sensitivity that captured both their beauty and their slightly sinister quality. The artist had employed subtle techniques to suggest the glass walls of the conservatory surrounding the plant, creating effect of the orchid existing simultaneously in natural and artificial environment. A duality that Poirot found metaphorically appropriate, given the plant's role in connecting crimes separated by decades, but united through human greed and violence. The old lady had lived long enough to see her family's affairs settled and her husband's murder acknowledged and avenged, dying in her sleep at Thornfield Manor, in the room she had occupied for more than 60 years. Her funeral, which Poirot attended, despite the journey from London requiring considerable effort for a man of his advancing years, drew representation from various communities, family members, botanical enthusiasts, and a surprising number of persons whose lives she had touched through decades of managing household and estate. The eulogy, delivered by the vicar, made reference to her strength in adversity and her determination to secure justice, qualities that Poirot had observed directly during their brief acquaintance, though the clergyman's phrasing suggested incomplete understanding of exactly what form that justice had taken and what costs it had exacted from all involved. In her will, Lady Cassandra left a bequest to Hercule Poirot, not of money, but of an object. A watercolour painting of the Midnight Emperor in full bloom, executed by a talented amateur artist who had been among the botanical observers present during the plant's flowering. The accompanying note explained that she wished Poirot to possess this image as a reminder of the case and as token of her gratitude. The painting hung thereafter in Poirot's flat, positioned where he could view it from his favourite chair. The image served as a reminder not of his detective triumph, but of the complex intersection of beauty and violence, value and destruction that characterized human interaction with both nature and each other. On quiet evenings, when his mind turned to contemplation of the cases that had occupied his professional life, Poirot would often find his gaze resting on the painted orchid, and he would recall the Golden Conservatory in all its magnificence, the people whose lives had been touched by crime committed in its humid atmosphere, and the satisfaction that came from applying the little grey cells to unravelling mysteries that others had considered insoluble. As the motor car carried him away from Thornfield Manor on that final visit for Lady Cassandra's funeral, Poirot permitted himself a moment of reflection on the case that had occupied his formidable talents for a brief but intense period years earlier. The countryside through which they travelled had changed little in the intervening decade. The same hedgerows and stone walls marking boundaries that had been established centuries before. The same villages maintaining their character despite the encroachment of modern conveniences. England endured, Poirot reflected. Its landscape and institutions possessing continuity that provided stability even as individual lives ran their courses from birth through death. Thornfield Manor would continue to stand long after all the persons involved in the case had passed from the world. The Golden Conservatory would house its exotic plants for generations yet unborn, and the Midnight Emperor, whether as original specimen or propagated descendants, would continue to bloom according to biological schedule that predated and would outlast human concerns. The detective's mind, however, remained focused not on endurance of landscapes and institutions, but on the human elements of the case that had revealed so much about character and motivation. Dr. Blackwood's progression from promising young physician to serial murderer had not been sudden descent, but rather gradual erosion of ethical boundaries, each small compromise making subsequent, larger transgressions more conceivable. The first murder, committed in desperation to conceal professional misconduct, had established pattern that became easier to repeat with each iteration. The physician's ability to maintain professional facade while conducting campaign of exploitation and occasional murder demonstrated compartmentalization of personality that Poirot had observed in other criminals who maintained dual existences as respectable citizens and ruthless predators. This capacity for divided consciousness fascinated and disturbed him, suggesting that human personality was less unified than comfortable social fictions pretended. The role of financial pressure in driving criminal behavior was an element that appeared consistently across Poirot's cases, though the Thornfield investigation had provided particularly clear illustration of how debt and declining status could motivate desperate actions. Sir Edmund's vulnerability to exploitation had stemmed directly from his financial difficulties, rendering him susceptible to schemes and manipulations that a more secure person might have resisted. The various marriage plots that had characterized the case, from Blackwood's pursuit of Vivian and later Lady Margaret, to Captain Ashford's mercenary interest in the Thornfield heiress, all reflected calculation that comfortable circumstances would have made unnecessary. Poirot had long understood that money, or lack thereof, was among the most reliable motivators of human behavior, and the Thornfield case had reinforced this understanding while also revealing the complex ways that financial pressure interacted with other motives, including revenge, pride, and fear. The question of justice and its relationship to truth had been central to Poirot's understanding of his own role throughout his detective career, and the Thornfield case had provided particularly clear illustration of the distinction between legal justice and broader moral accounting. Dr. Blackwood's conviction and imprisonment had represented legal justice, the physician being punished according to law for crimes that had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. But this legal resolution had not addressed all the harms that had been done, or provided full restoration to all who had suffered. The first, Sir Edmund Thornfield, had been murdered 5 decades before his killer faced consequences, and no legal penalty could restore the years of life that had been stolen from him. Sebastian Vale had been killed in pursuit of truth and vindication for his grandfather's legacy. And while his murder had been solved and punished, his death had left widow and potential children who would never be born. Vivian had survived physical attacks, but had endured psychological trauma that would affect her for the remainder of her life. Damage that no legal judgment could fully repair. These reflections on imperfect nature of justice led Poirot to consider the limitations of detective work and criminal prosecution as responses to wrongdoing. Solving murders and securing convictions were important achievements that served social good by removing dangerous persons from circulation and demonstrating that crime would be investigated and punished. But such reactive measures addressed symptoms rather than causes, responding to crimes already committed rather than preventing the conditions that generated criminal behavior. Financial desperation, professional misconduct, family dysfunction, and personal moral corruption. These were the soil in which crimes grew, and merely harvesting the poisonous blooms while leaving roots undisturbed ensured that similar crimes would occur elsewhere under comparable conditions. Poirot recognized that addressing root causes exceeded his capacity as individual detective, requiring social reforms and systemic changes that were province of legislators and institutions rather than private investigators. The botanical metaphors that the case naturally suggested had continued to occupy Poirot's thoughts in years since the investigation's conclusion. The Midnight Emperor itself, with its rare blooming and spectacular beauty, served as reminder that extraordinary phenomena often carried costs and complications that diminished their value. The orchid's beauty had indeed been remarkable, but that beauty had catalyzed human greed and violence in ways that made its looming as much tragedy as triumph. The parallel extended to human talents and achievements. Exceptional gifts often generated envy and exploitation. Success attracted parasites and predators, and distinction of any kind created vulnerabilities that ordinary existence avoided. Poirot himself had experienced this dynamic throughout his career, his detective abilities making him valuable to those seeking justice, but also making him target for criminals who sought to prevent exposure, or for rivals who resented his success. The conservatory itself, beyond its role as crime scene, represented broader themes about relationship between humans and nature that the case had illuminated. The Victorian construction of elaborate glass and iron structure to house tropical plants in English climate demonstrated human drive to control and dominate natural world, creating artificial environments that allowed cultivation of species that would never survive without constant technological intervention. The Midnight Emperor could not have existed at Thornfield Manor without the conservatory's temperature and humidity controls, without the imported soil and specialized fertilizers, without the expertise of gardeners who understood orchid cultivation. This achievement of horticulture was impressive, but also suggested dependence and fragility. Remove the technological supports and the exotic plants would die. The conservatory would become a mere empty shell, the entire enterprise revealed as artificial construct maintained through constant effort and expense. Human society, more broadly, displayed similar characteristics, Poirot reflected. Civilization itself being elaborate conservatory that allowed human flourishing but required constant maintenance of institutions and norms that prevented descent into barbarism. Dr. Blackwood's crimes had occurred not in lawless wilderness, but within structure of British society, with its courts and police and medical boards. Yet these institutional safeguards had proven insufficient to prevent or even detect systematic wrongdoing extending across decades. The physician had exploited exactly those social structures that were meant to ensure public safety, using his medical authority to gain access to victims and his professional expertise to conceal crimes. This parasitic relationship between criminal and social institutions that criminal exploited was pattern Poirot had observed repeatedly, suggesting that civilization created opportunities for sophisticated crime, even as it provided mechanisms for detecting and punishing such offenses. The role of beauty and aesthetic value in human affairs was another theme that the Midnight Emperor case had illustrated with particular clarity. The orchid's exceptional beauty had made it valuable, but that value had rendered it target for theft, subject of false claims, and catalyst for violence. Would the plant have been better off being merely ordinary, possessing no qualities that attracted human attention and greed? The question was unanswerable and perhaps meaningless when applied to plant that possessed no consciousness with which to experience better or worse. But applied to humans, the question had genuine relevance. Did exceptional beauty, talent, or achievement improve human lives, or simply create additional complications and dangers? Poirot's own experience suggested complex answer, his detective abilities having brought him satisfaction and sense of purpose, but also exposing him to dangers and moral complexities that ordinary existence would have avoided. The passage of time since the case's conclusion had allowed Poirot to observe long-term consequences of the investigation and the various ways that different persons had responded to their experiences. Vivian Thornfield's choice to remain unmarried and devote herself to estate management and the conservatory suggested that her brush with violence and deception had left her wary of intimate relationships and preferring autonomy to vulnerability of marriage. Whether this response represented wisdom or damage was difficult to determine, but it was certainly understandable given what she had endured. Arthur Thornfield's recovery from laudanum addiction and his subsequent literary success demonstrated that even persons who appeared weak or dissolute might possess resources for reform when sufficiently motivated by crisis. Lady Margaret's rapid decline and relatively early death illustrated how some persons collapsed when stripped of illusions and forced to confront harsh realities without protective fictions to cushion impact. These varied responses to shared trauma reminded Poirot that human resilience was distributed unequally, some persons possessing capacity to endure and recover from terrible experiences, while others were broken by challenges that their more robust neighbours survived. There was injustice in this unequal distribution of psychological strength, but it was injustice inherent in human variation, rather than wrongdoing that could be corrected through legal intervention. The detective's role was to establish facts and secure legal accountability for crimes, but the emotional and psychological aftermath of criminal victimization extended beyond law's reach into realm of personal character and individual capacity for recovery. This recognition of limits to what justice could achieve had tempered Poirot's satisfaction in solving crimes, understanding that legal resolution, while necessary and important, was not sufficient to fully repair damage that crime inflicted. The question of legacy and remembrance occupied Poirot's thoughts as the motorcar approached London's outskirts, the journey from Gloucestershire having provided several hours for contemplation. How would the Thornfield case be remembered in years and decades to come? Would it be reduced to sensational story of murders in conservatory, botanical specimens and exotic poisons, and beautiful women in peril? Or would deeper themes be recognized? Systematic professional misconduct spanning decades, exploitation of trust and authority for personal gain, the ways that financial pressure could drive persons to desperate and criminal actions. Poirot hoped that Arthur Thornfield's book would provide comprehensive and thoughtful account that would preserve complexity of case for future readers. But he recognized that popular memory tended towards simplification and sensationalism rather than nuanced understanding. His own role in the investigation would likely be remembered primarily through the dramatic confrontation and revelation, the theatrical denouement, where he had assembled suspects and exposed murderer through combination of physical evidence and psychological insight. This theatrical aspect of detective work was part that captured public imagination, feeding appetite for mystery stories and criminal narratives that emphasized clever investigators and dramatic revelations. But Poirot knew that the reality of detection was considerably less dramatic than popular conceptions suggested, consisting largely of patient interviewing, careful examination of physical evidence, methodical comparison of accounts to identify inconsistencies, and construction of logical arguments that connected disparate facts into coherent narrative. The dramatic revelation was merely culmination of work that was often tedious and always demanding of sustained concentration and attention to detail. The little grey cells, as Poirot habitually termed his mental faculties, had indeed been fully employed throughout the Thornfield investigation, processing information from multiple sources and identifying patterns that less systematic mind might have overlooked. The recognition that soil samples from conservatory contained cardiac glycosides at concentrations exceeding normal accumulation from legitimate plant cultivation had required knowledge of both chemistry and botany, combined with historical understanding of Victorian medical practice. The connection between these physical traces and the circumstances of the first Sir Edmund's death 50 years previous had required logical deduction that spanned decades and connected events that appeared unrelated to casual observation. The identification of Dr. Blackwood as murderer had required psychological insight into how professional authority could be exploited for criminal purposes, and how initial crime could establish pattern that became easier to repeat with each iteration. These various elements of the investigation had come together in synthesis that was simultaneously logical and intuitive, the product of both conscious reasoning and unconscious pattern recognition that Poirot's long experience had developed. He could not always explain precisely how he knew what he knew. The process by which observations and deductions coalesced into certainty, sometimes operating below level of conscious articulation. This quality of detective insight resembled artistic or musical ability in being partly innate gift and partly cultivated skill, natural aptitude enhanced through practice and experience to produce capability that exceeded what conscious effort alone could achieve. Poirot took pride in his detective abilities, while also recognizing them as gifts that carried responsibilities, his talents obligating him to employ them in service of justice and truth, rather than for merely personal advantage. The Golden Conservatory remained, he observed, as his thoughts returned to present moment and the funeral he had just attended, a monument to Victorian ambition and botanical achievement. But it would also stand as reminder that beauty could be cultivated through crime, that the most exquisite blooms might be nourished by corruption, and that justice, though delayed, would eventually penetrate even the most carefully maintained facades. The case of the Midnight Emperor was closed, its lessons absorbed into the store of human knowledge that Hercule Poirot had accumulated through his career of detecting crime and defending truth. The little grey cells, satisfied with their work, turned their attention toward anticipation of future challenges and the comfortable certainty that human nature would provide endless opportunities for their exercise in the service of justice, order, and truth.